2 Italian films in a row can be kind of rough, so let's try something a bit more mainstream. The Further Adventures of Tennessee Buck is about the coolest, most badass man alive, Buck Malone, an adventurer and womanizer somewhere in Borneo, who's hired as a guide by a pair of newlyweds who are here to go hunting, or at least the husband is. But as they go through the jungle, things don't go to plan. At all. I'm a little unsure of how to actually approach this film, partly because it's kind of a mishmash of different things, but mostly because at the 2/3 mark it takes a really dark turn, and I'm of 2 minds as to whether to lead with that or not. I think I'm going to ease you into it, kind of how the movie does, but I will say up front that unlike most films I'm talking about in this video, this one is most emphatically not suitable for children, no matter how it may seem at the start. That start is surprisingly entertaining, with our introduction to the characters being relatively fun. The newlyweds are clearly rich folk, but they're the kind that are likeable idiots as opposed to entitled or belittling. While Buck himself is so over the top in how amazing he is that it's just kind of fun. He has women basically at his beck and call. He's a crack shot, he's a seasoned hunter, he's great at everything basically. It's such a vanity project, it's unbelievable, which makes sense when you learn the actor playing him also directed the movie. After some shenanigans, Buck ends up being hired by the newlyweds to guide them through the jungle, and again, it's so silly that it's pretty fun. Of course Buck knows the locals here, and of course he gets to have sex with the topless dancer, who I can't even begin to show on YouTube, but yeah, she knows what she's got and she's not afraid to bounce him about. It's all a big, dumb, fun road trip, where the group all get along and trade jokes with each other, and it's actually pretty entertaining, despite Buck's warnings about cannibals in the area. Sadly, those cannibals are very much at the heart of the big twist I mentioned earlier, and not necessarily in the way you think, because after they catch the party going through the jungle, there is an extended sequence where the wife is stripped and oiled down, which is the scene the film is almost certainly best known for. It's why you hire Kathy Shower after all. They then not only release the husband so they can hunt him, at which point he reveals himself to be racist, so you know he's dead, but the tribe's chief throws his decapitated head to the wife. The wife he then rapes. And it's every bit as unpleasant as you would imagine. This is a massive tonal shift, completely at odds with everything else in the film. Even the other members of the cannibals had comedic moments prior to this, that it turns what was an otherwise relatively likeable film into something almost unconscionable. What makes this so much worse is that there was absolutely no reason for it. Killing the husband was enough to establish the cannibals as bad, as if them killing and eating people wasn't enough. You didn't need to follow that up. The fact they do completely changes the tone of the film, and you cannot come back from something like that. So the fact they tried to is just, no. You cannot have a rape scene and then 5 minutes later have a monkey knock someone out by dropping a fruit on their head. These things do not belong in the same movie. What the hell was David Keith thinking? You see why I struggled at the start of this one, right? Like I say, up to that point I was enjoying this and I was kind of prepared to recommend it. It may not have been the best directed movie, but the characters were fun, the adventure was entertaining, and overall it was a pretty likeable film. But then we get to the hour mark and the whole thing just collapsed. And not in a fun way. It collapsed in the worst way it could have. If someone were to re-edit the film and cut that scene out, it might be worth watching that version, but as is, no. Just no. And if you're one of the people looking for the extended version of those scenes, why? I don't particularly want to move from one distasteful film straight to another, but that's the way these lined up alphabetically. So next we have 1988's The Green Inferno, also known as Natura Contro, Paradiso Infernale, and most infamously, Cannibal Holocaust 2. It's that last name that should clue you into the kind of film this one is supposed to be, even though it's not directly related and was only given that name after the fact to cash in on the original Cannibal Holocaust. If you're not familiar with the original Cannibal Holocaust, well, as the name implies, it's a film about cannibals. More specifically, it's a video nasty, so it's got a ton of gratuitous gore and violence as the cannibals, eat people, as they're wont to do. Curiously, however, that's not actually what happens in the supposed sequel, because it's thankfully pretty tame as these types of films go. And I mean tame as in the main group who go into the jungle to look for a missing professor all make it out alive and in one piece. Green Inferno is actually known as the film that killed the cannibal genre, probably because there aren't actually any cannibals in it. So ironically, this cannibal film is tamer than Tennessee Buck, which is brilliant. If you thought I zipped through that setup, then rest assured the film does exactly the same thing. It spends more time on establishing how the initial trio acquire a plane, namely by stealing it, than it does on establishing the professor they're looking for. And as for why they're teaming up with a journalist, that's never really explained. Why would it need to be? Does it matter? Ultimately the answer is no, because that's not what you're here for, but it would have been nice to at least establish our main characters before we go on this adventure with them. Again though, that's not what this film cares about. What this film cares about is, and then, because it feels like they made up everything as they went along, filming an actual trip to the Amazon and then editing it down to make it somewhat resemble a movie. That isn't actually what happened, obviously, but it's how it feels, because there's no real discernible structure, and the group keep getting waylaid on their journey with video game style side quests. Things like, you need fuel? well, go find me 10 monkeys and you can have some. Or, oh no, gold prospectors have slaughtered a native tribe's camp. Let's go find them and make them pay. I'm sure we'll get a rare item and XP out of it. Not helping matters is the editing. The film's cut together so frenetically, it barely lingers on anything for more than a minute or two. So this is one of the most packed films I've ever encountered. It has one of the longest actual plot synopses I've ever seen because so much happens. Thing after thing after thing. It's bananas, and it all happens so fast you can't really focus on any of it. Is it a good movie? I would say no. Despite some decent camera work, the editing is way too fast-paced, the story doesn't let us get to know any of the characters, the film as a whole is surprisingly draining to watch, and the ending is one of the biggest "wait, what?" things I've seen in quite a while. It's hardly the worst movie ever made, but as I say, it's pretty exhausting to watch, so I don't really recommend it as a result. Also, please do not get this Green Inferno confused with Eli Roth's Green Inferno from 2013, which really is a horrible film about cannibals featuring ton of gratuitous gore and violence. It's also not very good, apparently, so if you needed further reason to skip it, then there you go. Sticking with an Italian jungle movie, again, but switching to a singular protagonist, The Secret of King Mahi's Island is the second ever movie starring B-movie actor Gary Daniels. Daniels is more known as a martial artist, so the fact he's been cast here as an indie-style treasure hunter is odd, but hey, if Chuck Norris could do it, badly, then I guess Daniels can as well. Probably the biggest issue with this film is finding it. Being a direct-to-VHS movie, it's not really available anywhere, beyond a brief clip that did the rounds on Twitter from the end of the film, where Daniels destroys a helicopter with a boomerang. I did eventually find a copy, several actually, but it was always on Russian websites, and as you'd expect, they all had Russian dialogue awkwardly forced over the top of the original Italian, making for a very awkward watching experience.
Чак, как они меня так быстро нашли?
I won't get too deep into the plot, since between the poor quality of the VHS rip and the language barrier, I couldn't understand the majority of it. But from what I can decipher, the massive blocks of text the film opens with, seriously, look at it. In this low quality, can you read this? There's an actual island where a great king lived, and he was buried with most of his treasure. A treasure that has a curse on it, and that's been sought after by treasure hunters for a very long time. Daniels doesn't really care about that, but when rival treasure hunters kill someone to learn of it, the dead man's children come to him for help. And being the sort of nice guy that he is, he gets caught up in the whole affair because of them. Like I say, that's what I could make out from the visuals, and frankly, that actually sounds way more interesting than this sort of film tends to be. The story seems to be pretty intriguing, and the action scenes, while infrequent, are at least half decent. It's also nice to have villains who are just evil. They mercilessly slaughter native villages, they threaten children, at least they're not trying to pretend they're something they're not, and that's a tad refreshing. Also, it's really nice for the main character not to have a token love interest, since the only real female of the film is the daughter, and she is, at best guess, 13 to 15? Hard to tell given the picture quality. However old she is though, it's clearly too young, so I am very glad they didn't go that route. Might have been nice to have an actual conclusion to the film, where maybe he takes them under his wing and helps raise them or something, but whatever. Overall, this seemed like a fun little film, and one I probably would have enjoyed, which is why it's so frustrating I can't find an English version. What's here seemed pretty decent, and short. It's an hour and 15 minutes, so it definitely doesn't outstay its welcome. If I ever track down a version I can recommend, I'll probably do so, but as is, pretty tough sell. Fortunately, Vibes is in English, though given it stars Cyndi Lauper, who spends the entire movie talking like this.
We've been working together now for a week, and I was wondering if maybe you want to move in with me. Louise, I'm lonely. Give me a chance here. Wait till I offer before you turn me down.
I kind of wish it wasn't. I'm only joking, she's not actually that bad, but yes, that is Cyndi Girls Just Wanna Have Fun Lauper, who plays a psychic with a spirit guide, alongside future meme machine Jeff Goldblum, who can touch things and see where they've been, since the vibes of the title refers to psychic vibes. Both are recruited from a psychic study group by Peter Falk, aka Columbo, who claims he wants the pair's help looking for his missing son, only to be forced to reveal he's actually looking for a lost city of gold in Ecuador. Sadly, we already know it's not gold thanks to the pre-title sequence, so it doesn't take a psychic to figure out this film isn't going to be amazingly written. Weirdly, the film was absolutely savaged by critics, but having seen it, I don't actually think it's all that bad. It's not great, to be sure, but on the whole, I thought it was fine. As I say, it's not exactly got the greatest script in the world, but it's light and breezy enough, and the two leads, along with Falk, are pretty good company, which makes sense given it's supposed to be a comedy. On that front, it did get a couple of good laughs out of me. Goldblum's deadpan delivery leads to a few moments, and Lauper's surprisingly committed to the bit, with some fun moments from her as well. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the movie is that they spent $18 million on it, because it does not look like it cost that much. There's basically no action, and I can't imagine Falk was that expensive, so I can only assume they blew it on location shots and unconvincing sets. Or maybe it went on celebrity cameos, because there's a couple of those dotted throughout. And to be honest, they're actually pretty fun. Keep your eyes open for a while, Steve Buscemi. Still, the film is fairly breezy, like I say. The cast is fun, and the direction is solid enough, so while it may not necessarily be worth tracking down, if you happen to stumble across it while it's on TV or something, you could certainly do a lot worse. Also, fun facts! Jeff Goldblum appeared in a Blink and You'll Miss It cameo on Columbo, while Cyndi Lauper would later play another psychic in a recurring role on the TV show Bones, though thankfully she played that role a little less over the top. Speaking of TV, there's one last production from 1988 to talk about, The Secret of the Sahara, an Italian 4-part series of 90-minute episodes, or 7 episodes that are 50 minutes long in some regions, as well as a condensed version that aired in cinemas, which is the version I really wish I'd watched, because 360 minutes is a lot of story to watch, especially when there's no English version. I had to struggle through the French one on YouTube, again with auto-translated subtitles. Starring Michael York, sadly best known to most people these days as Basil Exposition,
I suggest you don't worry about this sort of thing and just enjoy yourself. That goes for you all, too. Yes.
he plays an obsessive archaeologist who heads to the Sahara to discover the Talking Mountains and the treasures that lie within. Naturally, a bunch of stuff happens to him along the way, including encounters with deserters of the French Foreign Legion, who are being pursued by an overacting David Soul, who, because of bad writing, obviously has a history with York, Andie MacDowell as the Queen of the Red Warriors, the natives of the land constantly in conflict with the French Legion, and a man of peace in a violent world played by Ben Kingsley, of all people. Just don't ask me to tell you anything more specific, because I kept falling asleep while I was trying to watch it. I mentioned it was 6 hours, right? That's a lot to ask of anyone, especially for something that's as drawn out and repetitive as this is. I'll give credit where it's due, it's beautifully filmed. There are some truly stunning shots of the Sahara, and the action scenes are often quite large, with tons of people in them, so they come across as quite impressive. So yeah, it's well shot, and from what I can tell, well acted. York goes blind at one point, and it's not easy to keep that up when people keep waving their hand in your face. But it's still 6 hours, and you can bury a man in the sand and have them illogically kill a snake by biting its head off, but when that happens half an hour into the 3rd episode, and it's by far the most entertaining the show has been thus far, you're not going to appeal to many people at all. What I'm really getting at is how damn dry all of this is. If it were more entertaining, 6 hours in the desert wouldn't be all that bad, but everything here is played so straight, and there's so little flair to it all, that even in English this would be unbelievably tedious, and having to sit and read most of it just makes it doubly so. This is, most emphatically, not fun. Simply cutting out all the boring parts might not have been the best solution. I gather the 2-hour movie edit is somewhat incomprehensible, but there has to be a middle ground. Maybe have it as 3-hour-long episodes? I don't know, there's gotta be a way to take this material and make it watchable, because as is, not so much. Which brings me, unfortunately, to the adult content in this show, because there is some, and it's very much worth discussing. So, the first episode of both the 4-part and the 7-part versions contain a few shots with topless women in them. They're mostly in the background and aren't important or anything, but they're still there, so worth mentioning. After that, things settled down for a while, aside from a very PG-rated sex scene, but an hour into episode 3 in the 4-part version, which I think is the last 10 minutes of episode 5 in the 7-part one, there is a really unpleasant and largely unnecessary rape scene. Now you see why I wanted to talk about this, right? They showed enough restraint not to show the actual deed, but it's very clear that's what's going on, and much like in Tennessee Buck, even if you were enjoying this show, you certainly won't be after that. Look, I'm not a prude. I'm not averse to nudity, and I'm also not opposed to plot points like this happening, but there is a way to handle it that doesn't leave me feeling sick to my stomach. You can just imply something bad has happened to these women, and that'll be enough to get the point across. You don't have to leave your audience flabbergasted that you went there, because it's not shocking or edgy, it's just gross, and there's no need to go that far. And yes, I do realise I'm talking to a 25-year-old TV series at this point, and I'm not going to change anything, but whatever. I've had my rant, I've got it out of my system, there you go. Anyway, yeah, this sucks, don't watch it. I'm not even sure you can in English these days, beyond the movie version on VHS, which, like I mentioned, others say isn't edited particularly well, rendering the story not incomprehensible. Not that it matters. Despite the best efforts of the actors, I don't think any version of this is really worth your time. Speaking of time, and sticking primarily with TV, I think it's about time for another Jules Verne story now, so let's talk about 1872's Around the World in 80 Days. The plot of the story is pretty much all there in the title. It's about English gentleman Phileas Fogg making a wager that he can travel around the world in a mere 80 days, which was nigh unthinkable at the time. Naturally, all sorts of shenanigans go on as he encounters various issues along the way that threaten to prevent him from completing the journey in time, along with there being a mystery as to whether he's actually a bank robber using the trip as a way to evade the law. Given the scope of the story, it hasn't received as many live-action adaptations as you'd think, since it requires a large number of potentially expensive-to-realise locations, or a serious amount of condensing. So most times it's either a big-budget special event, or it's animated. For example, both Mickey Mouse and Tweety Bird have completed the journey for various reasons. We'll get all the animated versions out of the way first, which means we have to hop back a few years to 1983 to the Spanish-Japanese show Around the World with Wile E. Fogg, which which made its way to the UK the following year. Remember I told you to remember the name Wily Fogg? Well, this is why. Around the World with Wily Fogg is a full season of 26 half-hour episodes, or if you want to be pedantic, they're 26 minutes long, and it makes a few changes in the original, the most meaningful being Fogg's new house servant Passepartout, who wanted to work for Fogg because he's after a quiet life, and Fogg usually lives one, which is why he's so initially upset about the bet, is now turned into a different character who actually has a psychic of his own. Other changes include the addition of a villain hired by the man Fogg made the bet with, because he doesn't want to lose, which allows for someone else to do the more questionable things that Fogg did in the original story, and a much greater expansion on Princess Aouda, renamed Romy in this version, which is a welcome addition because she wasn't all that well realised in the original story. I actually grew up catching reruns of this show, so watching it again is super nostalgic, but I do have to concede that the animation is a little on the basic side and the voice acting can be a little rough.
Mr. Sullivan, to travel around the world, 3 months are unnecessary. 80 days would be sufficient, I think.
I have worked as a juggler, a trapeze artist, and a tightrope walker. Rigodon! Ma qui è bellissima!
Very much, Mr. Fogg. It's been a long time since I felt the happiness that I'm feeling now.
Overall, though, this is a pretty harmless little show, and while it's not amazing, and certainly padded to the nth degree, I did mention there were 22 episodes, right? It's perfectly serviceable, and it has a charm that a lot of cartoons in that time period did. There's certainly worse shows you could let your kids watch. One thing I never realised until looking into it for this list is that there was actually a sequel series, Wily Fogg 2, which came out about a decade later in 1993. I mentioned it in passing earlier, but rather than redo the journey around the world, which would be kind of repetitive, instead, Fogg and company take 2 all-new journeys. One based on Journey to the Centre of the Earth, and one 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. Incidentally, 20,000 Leagues is roughly 80,000 kilometers, which would be the equivalent of going around the world twice. Rather appropriate for a sequel series. I'm not going to say much about the second season, since it is largely more of the same sort of thing as the first one, just underground and underwater rather than above, and because, again, it's 26 episodes that are around 26 minutes each. But from what I can tell, it's about the same level of quality as the first season, maybe a tad worse, but not substantially so. Again, I'm sure it's fine for kids. I will briefly talk about the show's legacy before moving on, because surprisingly, it actually has one. In 2008, to celebrate the show's 25th anniversary, there was a live-action stage musical of the story in its home country of Spain. It was only supposed to run for 3 months, but due to its popularity, ended up going for 15. That's a run 5 times longer than initially planned, so yeah, it was popular. Also, there's supposed to be a CGI film adaptation coming out sometime in 2023, which, honestly, I kind of want to check out. Like I say, I grew up with the show. I'm curious how a big screen adaptation will turn out. Incidentally, I'd like to apologise to anyone else who remembers this show, because that earworm of a theme song will now be stuck in your head for days. Just be thankful I didn't mention D'Artagnan and the Three Muskehounds. Did you know they made a CGI film of that show too? Apparently it's not that bad, but talk about running out of ideas.
One for all, and all for one!
God, this entry is making me feel old. Back to Around the World in 80 Days, which was what we were talking about. The next animated adaptation is the 1988 one from Australia, and, much like Wily Fogg, it's also on YouTube, so if you're genuinely curious, you can go watch it yourself. You know, after you're done with this video, obviously. I promise, we've not got much longer to go. As with Wily Fogg, all the characters are now anthropomorphized, which is a really irritating to say word that means everyone's an animal. Usually a dog because they're easy to design, but unlike Wily Fogg, here they blaze through the story at rocket speed, because otherwise the target demographic might lose interest. Unfortunately, this has the side effect of meaning that nothing has time to stick. The journey as depicted in the original story is pretty packed, so you really need a feature-length film at least to properly cram everything in. Doing it in around 45 minutes means you're going to have some real pacing problems. Problems that mean we barely get to know the main characters before the titular journey starts at the 10-minute mark, with him and Passepartout speeding through the journey with barely a minute or two spent at each location, and Princess Aouda is completely glossed over, depriving Fogg of a character arc in the process. You know, things like that. Honestly, I'd say that's the biggest issue with this adaptation, which otherwise isn't too bad, and is miles better than the animated version of King Solomon's Mines. The animation's pretty decent, though the spinning scene transitions can be quite irritating, the voice work is perfectly serviceable, and overall, it's absolutely fine. If this is the only way you want to see the story, it'll do, but that fast pace does mean it isn't really doing the source material justice, because there is a fun story here. It's just a shame this version doesn't stop long enough to properly tell it. I'm also aware of another animated adaptation from 1990, and by aware I mean I have it on DVD, but there's very little about it online, and the back of the box is no help whatsoever. Aside from the film's description being full of grammatical errors, they put an apostrophe in days, so they couldn't even get through 6 words without screwing up. The only information I can glean about it is that it was released by ILC. Meanwhile, my main source of information on these things, IMDb, says that it's a co-production between Canada and Ireland. And watching it, yeah, I can believe this is the work of 2 entirely different countries. From the very beginning, which bafflingly wastes 2 precious minutes of its short 46-minute runtime showing us scenes from later on completely out of context, this adaptation seems determined to be one of the most bewildering and difficult to decipher of the lot. Remember I said there was a bank heist in the opening? Well, the robber looked like Phileas Fogg, which is why the police spend the entire adventure chasing after him. Now, imagine only learning about that because a bunch of English upper-class twits are discussing it while reading the newspaper, as opposed to, I don't know, showing it like every other version of the story does. This is the only adaptation that commits the cardinal sin of constantly failing to follow the show don't tell rule, resulting in huge swaths of plot being thrown at you via exposition dumps. And if you thought the 88 adaptation was speedy, I mean, it is, but it's got nothing on this, which doesn't so much as speed through the opening part of the journey as it does skip over it entirely. Whole sections are given barely a glance, while others, the more action-heavy scenes, are lingered on for far too long, which, given the shoddy animation, was a very bad idea. It's so bad that I'd argue you could easily end up getting hopelessly confused if you don't already know the original story, which means it's a pretty poor adaptation. Not helping, as I say, is the frankly shoddy animation that means the whole thing looks terrible. Doubly so for the utterly inept action scenes that, again, go on way too long. And the fact that the dialogue for most of the characters is actually quite badly delivered, so it was surprisingly difficult to understand at times. All of these issues combined mean that this is one of the worst animated adaptations I've ever seen, and I'm glad I barely paid anything for it. Right, with those out of the way, let's move on to the live-action adaptations now by jumping back a year to 1989, when Pierce Brosnan and Eric Idle decided to make the trip in a 3-part miniseries for NBC. This was that weird period of Brosnan's career where he was kind of adrift after the producers of Remington Steele basically screwed him out of being Bond, leading to Timothy Dalton's run. And then they kind of screwed him out of being Remington Steele, so he had to do whatever he could get his hands on, like being the bad guy in Mrs. Doubtfire.
I saw it! Some angry member of the kitchen staff. Did you not tip them? Oh, the terrorists, they ran that way. It was a run by fruiting.
Until GoldenEye came round and rescued him from Direct Like Livewire.
She drank the water, sweat, shook, then boom!
Golden Globe nominee, everyone. While this adaptation does stray a little further from the source material than the animated ones, the fact it's got so much more time in its hands, it's essentially 3 90-minute movies, making for a total of 4.5 hours, means it can actually delve into the plot in much greater detail than the 2 animated films I just covered, which really works in its favour. The characters are properly introduced, the inciting bet is given much more weight, it'll bankrupt Fogg if he loses it, the issues they encounter along the journey are given much more time to develop, and the whole adventure is just kind of fun. At least, mostly. A good chunk of the elements are here for a fun adventure. Unfortunately, Brosnan plays Fogg as a very uptight gentleman.
I am Mr. Phileas Fogg, and this charming lady here is the Princess Aouda of Pillager, India.
Who doesn't really seem to have much patience for cultural differences? That's probably the best way to put it. Let's use an example. He reaches Hong Kong only to learn that the roads are closed because the Empress is travelling. Obviously, that's massively inconvenient for him and his bet, but he just thinks, stuff that, we'll go anyway. So he does, upsetting the locals in the process and getting arrested as a result. It's frustrating because Pierce Brosnan can be incredibly charming. You only have to watch Remington Steele, or any of his Bond films, or Lord help you, Mamma Mia, to know that. And yet he's deliberately dialing that charm back in service of a role that just doesn't play to his strengths. Like I said, I know he was taking basically any part he could get, but despite his best efforts, this is not one that serves him well, sadly. Up against him, I'm a little surprised to say, but Eric Idle does a bit better as Passepartout, despite his French accent constantly making me think he was about to break out into a Monty Python sketch.
Your mother was a hamster, and your father smelt of elderberries.
I served him faithfully, monsieur, in the imperial household before the fall of the Second Empire.
He's certainly better than Peter Ustinov playing Detective Fix, the man who's chasing Fogg all over the world, trying to arrest him for the bank robbery he probably didn't do. Ustinov is clearly playing up the comedy aspect, but his role is pretty weak, and try as he might, he can't salvage it. For what it's worth, the rest of the cast is fine, though this Queen Victoria seems a tad skinnier than most interpretations, and the way it's all filmed is mostly pretty good, with some nice camera work and such helping to keep things interesting. It's just a shame the lead character is so proper. Despite those issues though, I did still find myself enjoying this. It's not perfect by any means, but it's still surprisingly entertaining, and even if Fogg doesn't really change until the last episode, he and his group still find themselves in some rather amusing fixes they have to somehow find their way out of. I'm still not quite sure what it is exactly, but something about this was oddly compelling. Not the highest praise in the world, I'll admit, but it's very watchable isn't nothing now, is it? After this, the next live-action version was a feature film from 2004. This is the one that has Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jackie Chan in it, so you might have heard of it. You also might have heard that it's not very good, and that is kind of the case, but also kind of not. Part of the problem is that it's supposed to be a comedy, which means that the whole thing feels like it's a mix between the original story, where Fogg is pretty damn resourceful, and Jeeves and Wooster. If that means nothing to you, I'll explain the core concept behind it. You have a likeable idiot, played here by Steve Coogan, with a manservant, Chan here, being a hyper-competent sidekick who gets the idiot out of all the sticky situations he winds up in due to his own lack of awareness. It's a pretty classic trope that's been used in all sorts of stuff, from Big Trouble in Little China to Wallace and Gromit. That last analogy is actually a pretty good one, because while this Phineas Fogg isn't a moron, he is an inventor who gets a little too focused on his work to the exclusion of everything else, which means he is now nothing like the version from the book and all the other adaptations. If you're going to change the character so much, why even bother making this at all? Wait, it's Hollywood, never mind. This also explains why Passepartout is only an alias Jackie Chan uses, and why he was the person who robbed the Bank of England. Only it wasn't money he stole, it was a jade Buddha, which is a protective relic from his village that was stolen by an evil Chinese general, and why would you make such a straightforward story so complicated? Half the charm of the original story is its simplicity. It's literally a race around the world, and half the fun is seeing the journey, what new obstacles get in the way, how the group will find a way to overcome them, and what happens to poor old Detective Fix, who's really only doing his job. And when the film focuses on those elements, it's actually not too bad. Some of the events the group encounters while they're racing around the world are quite fun, if not amazing. But the film often skips over the actual journey, focusing more on what happens in each location instead. So often the group will just be in a new place without really telling us how they got there. Plus, when all these new plot elements they've added in pop back up, which they frequently do because there's Chinese soldiers after Chan pretty much everywhere they go, you just kind of go, well, this came out of nowhere, because it's where he does his martial arts thing. And to be fair, Chan is every bit as entertaining here as in his Armor of God trilogy. But as impressive as his shtick is, the martial arts fighting feels wildly out of place in a story that's supposed to take place all across the world in the late 19th century. So there's issues, to be sure. But on the other hand, the physical comedy does actually work better than it should a lot of the time. This got some genuine guffaws from me in places. It's directed decently enough, and it moves along at a fair clip. But those tonal issues and weird, unnecessary additions mean that while I did enjoy parts of it, other parts felt very off. And the end result is a confused mess that never quite coalesces. It's not as bad as everyone says, but it's not exactly great either. And if you're wondering where he turns up, then Schwarzenegger's playing a Turkish prince who wants to make the female lead his 7th wife. It's every bit as racially sensitive as that sentence sounds. It's a shame, the scene should be quite fun, but then he speaks and you remember that this is basically a Californian in blackface and yeah. We've come a long way since 2004? Jesus. We'd have to wait over 15 years for the next adaptation, at which point, like buses, we got 2 at the same time. We'll cover the 8-part TV show first, which started airing right at the end of 2021 and starred David Tennant, because we apparently don't have that many famous actors in England, and if James Bond can make the journey, so can the Doctor. This adaptation updates things to be a little more equal opportunity. The butler Passepartout is now black as well as French, the pair are joined in the adventure by a female journalist who wants recognition, which, fair enough, and the Indian woman who Fogg meets, rescues and falls in love with in the original story is now relegated to 1 episode about halfway through the show's run. Oh, and they also encounter more historical figures than just Jesse James, because Indiana Jones isn't the only one who can do that. Jesse James, incidentally, isn't in this version, despite the fact he would have fit in really nicely. In case you couldn't tell, this is one of the least faithful adaptations, at least on paper. It does manage to retain the spirit of the original story though, which is the main issue I tend to have with remakes that change things, and the changes made here are less, we need to pad out the story to fit 6 hours, and more, if we actually analyse what's going on in the world around 1875, then Fogg's journey would take him through so many genuine historical events it just makes sense to include a few of them. Passepartout being French, for example, gives them a way to explore what was happening in France at that point, as his brother is part of the revolution that was taking place at the time. And when they reach the desert, they run into Jane Digby, a historical figure from England's past that I'd never even heard of before. Most other adaptations tend to brush past these sort of events, but again, this one has the time to properly explore it, and these are far from the only events it does this with. So on the one hand, this does make this adaptation stand out, but on the other hand, the pace of the story can really drag as a result, and the tone is most emphatically not light-hearted. If you came to this show expecting a rollicking adventure, that is not what they're going for, because for the most part, it's very dry, lacking even a hint of humour. Passepartout's brother? Shot to death right in front of him, in slow motion with poignant music and everything. This is a very serious take on the story, and ultimately, that's my main issue with it. Don't get me wrong, this is not a bad show. Not at all. The cast is great, it's shot wonderfully, the music is lovely, and it's a very well-made program overall. But because it's playing everything so seriously, it loses a lot of the charm of the original story. Fogg's a good example. He's not the super competent person he's usually depicted as. Here, he's a man filled with deep regrets and starts the story with a profound lack of self-confidence, which makes for a good character arc, but means he isn't much fun to hang out with for a good chunk of the story. Except for a bit in episode 4 where he's drugged and starts reverting back to his worst moments as the Doctor, i.e. gurning and acting like a kid on a sugar rush. Other examples? The vast majority of the second episode is spent on a train going across Italy, and the sixth episode is spent almost entirely on a deserted island. Good for character development, to be sure, but when you spend almost the entirety of a 45-minute episode on people arguing and moping, it isn't the most interesting thing to watch. Again, this isn't bad, it's just a very different take on the source material that, despite its globe-trotting premise, doesn't have anywhere near as much action as others. Even the Pierce Brosnan version had more going on in that regard, and that was made 30 years prior. Christ, I feel so old saying that. So yeah, that's probably the biggest issue I have with this version. It's slower paced and less action-packed, which, if you're on board with that, is great. Like I say, this is a good show, and watched week to week, it probably would have been better. I binged the whole thing over a weekend, and yeah, don't do that. Oh, and because history, like the globe, is circular, the series was renewed for a second season, which is heavily hinted to be inspired by 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. Wonder if that actually mentioned the sea is, even at its lowest point, only 2 or 3 leagues deep. The other adaptation from 2021 is one you probably won't even be aware of, mostly because it's a French-made CGI film aimed at kids. I won't spend too long on this. It's a kids animated film, not an indie-style adventure, but unlike all the previous adaptations, it deviates from the setup quite a bit. This isn't set in Victorian London, it's set in a fictitious animal kingdom, and has Passepartout, a marmoset here, as the main lead, who ends up entangled with con artist Phileas Frog, which is such an obvious play on words I have to call into question why the previous animated versions didn't do it, as he is caught up in a dare to go around the yada yada, you know this bit. As far as kids films go, it's fine, just too fast-paced. And I mean it's very fast-paced. If you're not familiar with the French, they speak very quickly and their films tend to follow suit in all aspects. And frankly, it's too predictable, even accounting for the fact I've seen the story like 6 times at this point. Did you expect the woman to be the smart one? Congratulations, you've seen a film before. It has a runtime of just over 80 minutes and will probably entertain younger audiences just fine, but older watchers will see all the jokes coming a mile away, will get sick of all the pop songs, and will probably just zone out long before the all is lost moment arrives to signal the end of the second act. Like I say, perfectly fine kids film, but for grown-ups, not so much. And on that rather damp squid of a note, we end our look at the various adaptations of Jules Verne's other classic. Overall, they're a mixed bag, and if I had to pick one out as being the best, it would somewhat surprisingly be the Australian animated version. It may gloss over a lot, but it does hit all the major beats from the original story. It's got surprisingly decent voice acting, and it's under 45 minutes long, so it lacks any padding. It's not fantastic, but on the other hand, you can watch it in your lunch break, so swings and roundabouts. If you want the best live-action version, that's a tougher question to ask. All 3 have their positives and their negatives, and you could almost put it down to a coin toss as to which one is the best. You know, if a coin had 3 sides. But if you put a gun to my head and made me choose, can't believe I'm saying this, but when I think back and ask myself which one I enjoyed the most, I think it's the Jackie Chan one. It's deeply flawed, yes, and it changes a fair bit from the original story, but it made me laugh a lot. It kept me entertained all the way through, and ultimately it's the one I have the most fond memories of. Maybe the David Tennant one was better made, and maybe the Pierce Brosnan one was more faithful to the source material, but for better or worse, I enjoyed the Jackie Chan one the most, and sometimes that's enough to swing it. Also, it's got Jim Broadbent playing an over-the-top villain, and Kathy Bates as Queen Victoria, which, I'm sorry, that just trumps everything.
I love being able to do that.
Let's head back to '89 now, with a very unusual take on an adventure film with Brenda Starr, starring Brooke Shields, who we've seen before in Wet Gold, as the title character, and a slightly miscast Tony Peck as the writer of the comic strip in which she appears, because there's being meta, and then there's being Brenda Starr. Let me back up and explain. Brenda Starr is a real comic strip, starting life as Brenda Starr reporter back in 1940 in the Chicago Tribune Syndicate, and continuing all the way up until 2011. She's made the jump to actual comic books and TV movies, but in 1986 she made her way to a big budget movie, which took things in a more unique direction. Unfortunately, due to rights issues, which are so complicated it's worth looking into in its own right, the film wasn't released for years. It first came out in France in 1989, along with a few other international markets, and didn't come out in the US until 1992, where it bombed at the box office and was pulled from theatres with alarming speed. Did it deserve to fail? I wouldn't say so. I actually quite enjoyed it, but I can understand why others, critics in particular, did not. So, plot. As I say, in this film, Brenda Starr is the fictional creation of Mike Randall, but he's a struggling artist who's none too thrilled to be stuck drawing nothing but her, and often says so out loud, only for the character herself to turn to him and say she's fed up with him underappreciating her, much to his surprise, obviously, and she promptly quits the comic. Seeing no alternative, Randall draws himself into the comic to try and fix things, and ends up getting caught in one of her adventures, namely heading into the Amazon to find a scientist who's created a formula to convert water into cheap fuel. This is the indie part, if you're wondering. Technically, this film counts as a comic book adaptation, and it was originally intended to come out around the same time as Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy, and as you can tell, it shares a lot of similarities with that regarding tone and style, although it's significantly better than Beatty's efforts. Unfortunately, what the sucked into a comic book premise ended up reminding me most of, even if it isn't actually used all that much in the film itself, was a not particularly good film from Don Bluth that also has a comic creator ending up in his creation in interacting with a femme fatale. In that film though, the femme fatale is ultimately the villain, so at least it has that going for it. Here, Brenda Starr is a strong, competent journalist, but she's also worried about tearing her dress and messing up her hair, so, you know, one step forward, one step back. That's mostly down to the material though, and Shields is absolutely giving it all she's got, which helps immensely. Pretty much all the cast are trying their best, to be honest, including another favourite of mine, Timothy Dalton. So imagine my delight when I discovered he was in this, even if he sounds very English for someone supposedly from Brazil and isn't actually in this all that much. Another highlight is the pacing. I know I mention this a lot, but it is important. If a film is too slow-paced, it can become astonishingly dull. See Secret of the Sahara. But on the other extreme, if it's too fast-paced, it can be hard to process everything the film throws at you. See Down Twisted or The Green Inferno. Brenda Starr manages to get it right. It moves at a fair clip, but never so fast that you can't follow what's happening. And it never forgets to explain things when it needs to, but not to the point of over-explaining everything. The end result is a film that's fast and frenetic, but never overwhelming. Even when the film leans heavily into its comic aspects, which it does a fair bit in the first half, but less so later on, it never pulls you out of the experience, because the fast pace often matches the feel of a comic. It helps that these elements can often be quite fun. One highlight is a scene where Randall goes into a coffee shop and reads a paper, only to find the strip is literally describing what's happening to him right now, as well as what's about to happen to him. It's a cute bit that works pretty well, so it's a shame that scene's pretty much a one-off, and future references to the comic origins of this are largely down to transition shots. Is it a flawless film? No, of course not. The irreverent tone means that the film is destined to be a fairly light experience, and while it is a fun ride, the constant pace means the structure of the film is a bit all over the place, the ending is a little on the weak side, and as I say, the framing device with the comic's author is, well, you could easily cut his plot out entirely with very little effort, so yeah, it's not super well utilised. On the whole though, as I mentioned before, I really enjoyed this. It's a fun little romp that's not too heavy and a pretty decent time, and aside from a few curse words, it's completely family friendly. It never really took off in the way it deserved to, but that shouldn't stop it from being enjoyed. Give it a go, see what you think. Let's go back to something a little more familiar, though no less silly, with the wonderfully named Cannibal Women in the Avocado Jungle of Death. Coming to us from Full Moon Features, which also in a roundabout way gave us Eliminators, this is Shannon Tweed's feminist professor and what should be a blonde bimbo, even though she's brunette, tasked by the government to track down the titular cannibal women, who have become increasingly hostile, and convince them to move out of their jungle so it can be harvested for its avocados, since America is apparently facing something of a shortage. Along for the ride is a particularly sexist guide, so naturally they spend the whole movie arguing about gender issues. In case you haven't picked up on the fact, this is a comedy first and foremost. In fact, one IMDb review calls it Heart of Darkness as a comedy, and that's kind of a good way to sum it up in a single sentence. Although it doesn't mention that the cannibal women also wear incredibly skimpy outfits, so I had fun editing this particular section. As far as comedies go, this did actually make me laugh quite a bit, and I could see some of the jokes slotting into a Naked Gun or Hot Shots style slapstick parody film, which is high praise indeed. Unlike a lot of the comedies I've covered thus far, there's genuine effort put into these gags, and while some of them could be a little on the nose, and some of them completely miss the mark, the ones that hit really hit. Which isn't to say it's all that great a film, because, well, it's not. There's clear budgetary restrictions that limit things. An attack by a hippo is done without ever actually showing a hippo, for instance, and it's not a laugh riot or anything. Again, some of the jokes barely count as jokes. On the positive side, the cast is clearly game, and even if Bill Maher, surprisingly, isn't actually all that funny, he's clearly trying. It's the female leads that run away with the film though, and deservedly so, because their characters are more interesting ones and the actresses are far more fun company in general. I always forget Shannon Tweed is actually a pretty decent actress. Overall, this isn't a fantastic film by any stretch of the imagination, but as far as comedies go, I've seen far worse. It moved fairly quickly, it was shot, well, probably fairly decently relative to the budget they had. It got a few laughs out of me, although to be fair, the biggest laugh was when I blatantly saw a stagehand holding a sign in place, and overall it's fine, though all the talk of feminism did get pretty old after a while. Not because I disagree with it or anything, they just never shut up about it. If you can get over that, then yeah, it's okay, I guess. Sticking with comedies, or supposed ones anyway, there's also Duel of the Gods, a weird spin-off from the God Must Be Crazy series, but not too much of one since those weren't set during World War II. If Duel of the Gods has one thing going for it, it's a banging theme tune. It's a shame nothing else in the film comes even remotely close to it. Plot-wise, it should be fairly straightforward. The Nazis want the titular Duel of the Gods, or as everyone refers to them, the Purple Diamonds. Yes, really. Because it's super powerful, and being Germans, they want to use it to win the war. Conversely, a bunch of other people obviously want to stop them. Like I say, should be simple, but instead it's all manner of complicated because there's an Australian who wrote about the diamond in a book but doesn't actually know where it is. There's an American spy disguised as an Indian using really uncomfortable blackface.
Are you an American Indian?
Oh, no, an Indian from Calcutta.
I am Prince Lalejama from the Ringy-Dingy Heights near Bombay, Calcutta, and New Delhi, India.
There's someone's niece and someone else's nephew getting in the way. It's all a mess, and it's all thrown at us within the first 10 minutes at such a blinding pace it's really quite difficult to follow. Not helping matters is that, as I say, it's supposed to be a comedy, so everyone seems to speak in a very off-putting manner that I think is supposed to be silly, but just comes across as annoying. On top of that, everyone's trying to crack jokes, but barely any land, so most of the dialogue is pretty much awful. Characters act like arseholes to each other, there's supposedly wacky situations, which aren't, the story barely makes sense, the supposed advanced civilization is clearly a disused factory. It all combines to make the whole film surprisingly tough to get through. Finally, there's all the weird tonal shifts. This starts as an unfunny, but generally light-hearted affair. Well, except for all the swearing and a very unfunny rape joke.
But he did give me a personal message to pass on to you.
No, chin up, don't drink too much, and don't rape anybody important.
But around an hour in, suddenly the attack on Pearl Harbor is mentioned, almost as a throwaway gag. But trying to warn the West about it becomes a major plot point. It's so bizarre. It's like the script was only half finished when they started filming and they just let the actors improv to bump up the runtime. Though it clearly wasn't, given the stunt work in the film, which means most of this must have been scripted. Yeesh. Pretty much the only saving grace is the quick pace. Everyone's trying to be zany, so that means manic, right? And manic means fast-paced. So even if no one's being funny, they're at least getting through the material quickly so they can try, and fail, at the next set piece. That, sadly, is the best way to describe this film. A failure. And there are few things more miserable than a failed comedy, because if it's not funny, you're just left with people acting in a very irritating way, saying very irritating things through very irritating events. It's a very irritating film, is basically what I'm saying. Less irritating, though not by much, is another from our old friends at Canon Films, River of Death. Unusually for these types of films, it's actually based on a book, namely one of the same name by Alistair MacLean, who also wrote quite a few novels based around World War II. The Guns of Navarone and Where Eagles Dare are perhaps the best known. River of Death isn't regarded as one of his best, so it's probably just as well the film makes quite a few alterations. Notably, this is one of the few films I've ever seen that actually tries to make a Nazi likeable, namely by giving him a daughter he cares about and wanting to stop a crazy scientist from experimenting on his prisoners. Guess how long he lasts? This is also where we meet Donald Pleasance, who has experienced playing this sort of role, and who plans to escape the fall of the Third Reich with said Nazi scientist, who promptly betrays him, causing him to swear revenge, however long it takes. Cutting rather abruptly to 20 years later, in the mid-60s, Michael Dudikoff, another 80s B-movie regular, is hired to help a small team treat a plague affecting the native tribes of the Amazon. And when they try to locate the source of this plague, it goes wrong almost immediately, because this opening moves faster than a freight train, as Dudikoff has to leave a girl behind as he escapes a hostile tribe and an out-of-place Nazi. Because in one of those plot twists that isn't surprising in the slightest, this is where that mad scientist ended up. And if you guessed that Dudikoff would eventually end up teaming with Donald Pleasance, who isn't forthcoming about his true motivations, in order to track the scientist down and find the girl, then hey, you too can write a generic 80s action movie. I'm being snarky, clearly, but that's largely because almost every single plot point in this parable is particularly predictable, being signposted with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. That doesn't necessarily make it bad, but it is very by the numbers, and your mileage may vary on whether that's a good thing or not. For me, not so much. I've seen this story a dozen times, and I'll inevitably see it a dozen more, especially once the surprisingly large group, which includes the girl from the opening, all grown up, because why else would that character be here, finally gets on their way at the 45-minute mark, which is way later than it should be in this sort of story. Not helping matters is how straight the film is played. With a story like this, you need a little bit of levity to keep you going. Not necessarily a huge amount, because too much can almost be worse, but you do need some. Otherwise the journey becomes something of a slog. And yeah, that's what happens here. It's drier than the desert. Even with the fighting and the explosions and the betrayals, you start tuning out, because it's all so blah. Again, none of this is bad or anything. It's decently shot, the action is fine, if a little repetitive, and the cast are not particularly good shots, but they're okay for what they are, which is to be slowly whittled down over the course of the journey, because again, predictable. You don't have a cast this big if half of them aren't there solely to die along the way to show how dangerous it is, even if some of them don't so much die as just vanish from the film. Frustratingly, the weak link is Dudikoff, largely because his narration, which is sprinkled throughout, is spoken with some of the flattest, most monotone delivery I've ever heard. I don't like using video game references in this video, but I was getting serious Metroid Other M flashbacks from this.
Most of the dreams I've ever had fade away. But this one, I'll never forget.
A dream. I had been reliving the tragic moments of my recent past.
It's doubly weird because he's actually fine in person. It's just his narration that's flatter than a pancake. I guess after filming in South Africa for months, he didn't have much enthusiasm left to do the ADR, which I think we can all sympathise with. Overall though, again, this is fine if utterly unremarkable. Perfectly generic fare that's only really memorable for the thoroughly depressing ending where basically everyone dies. Yay. Oh, and the wig Donald Pleasance wears, which is not only very noticeable, it's also supposed to disguise who he is, I think? And when that's the only thing you'll remember about a film, well, that kind of says it all, doesn't it? Slightly more memorable is the thriller The Evil Below, and that's only partly because it stars Jake Speed himself, Wayne Crawford. In this one, he plays the captain of a ship who, along with his employee, is hired by a treasure hunter to help find the wreck of a long-lost Spanish galleon, which sank in 1683 and has somehow remained undiscovered until present day. Mostly because those who do find it end up mysteriously dying to laughably unconvincing barracuda shark things that turn out to be more supernatural in nature than you'd think. One of 6 underwater-themed movies to come out between 89 and 90, The Evil Below is no James Cameron masterpiece. In fact, it's actually kinda dull. That's no real surprise to people familiar with these kind of films, as it's incredibly difficult to make scenes set underwater exciting. By their very nature, they have to be quite slow-paced, and even with music, they tend to end up feeling pretty quiet. So as a result, they'll often end up slowing the film as a whole down to a crawl. That could be forgivable if the action above the water were interesting, but it's kinda not. Things do happen, and they happen fairly quickly, but they're not shot very well, and the editing is pretty rough, so it has all the feel of a not particularly great TV movie, with all its flat shots and handheld camera sequences lending a slightly amateurish feel to things. Not helping is Crawford, who, as Max Cash, seriously, is a pretty damn unlikable protagonist. I'd hoped not trying to be super suave and cool might have gotten a better performance out of him, but his interpretation of grizzled and worn down results in a pretty unpleasant character who belittles people, lashes out at the first sign of a disagreement, is more than happy to start fights with people he doesn't like, and constantly tries to get the treasure hunter to give up and go home. Admittedly, he's got good reason to do so. The ship's been sunk for 300 years. If there were any treasure within, it'd probably be long gone by now. But he's such an arse about it that you kind of wanted to find it just to spite him, and you wonder why she's so eager to keep working with him. Also, and this is probably a production thing, so you can actually see it, but the ship doesn't actually appear to be that deep underwater. So again, the fact that no one else has found it seems unlikely, even with the curse around it that the film occasionally remembers to say exists, because this is also supposed to be a horror movie, despite it being less scary than the Asylum's Little Mermaid knockoff. Jesus, did they not watch that before releasing it? This is not a good film. Despite a decent pace, it's blandly shot, with an unlikable lead and a plot that just kind of goes all over the place. People are introduced just to be killed off screen, there's a subplot with a priest that goes nowhere, rival treasure hunters are cartoonishly evil for no good reason, and don't even get me started on the villains. Eesh. Another film that, to give the game away early, isn't good is The Secret of the Ice Cave, a kids' film that no one has ever heard of that was distributed by Canon Films, which usually means it's either gloriously awesome or utterly abysmal. As I've already ruined the surprise by revealing it's the latter, I'm just going to get into the 3 main reasons as to why. First, the acting is awful across the board, from adults to children alike. This isn't helped by the lead being a kinda irritating 16-year-old, whose other film roles include being the kid from Over the Top, arguably Sylvester Stallone's best film, #sarcasm, with his main co-star being his 15-year-old love interest. And before you get all weird about it, I only know their ages because the trailer said so. Why the trailer would point that out is another matter entirely, but whatever. Secondly, the film's budget is shockingly small. It's about what a film studio CEO makes in a week or two, so if you were hoping for a thrilling adventure with plenty of action scenes, then you're right out of luck. Then again, it's a kids' film, so you probably weren't going to get that anyway, but Finally, the story is almost as stupid as I am for deciding to do this whole project. Seriously, the films I've had to endure for this series have caused me serious psychological harm that'll take me months to recover from. An issue not helped by films like this, where the plot doesn't have a clue what it's doing and no idea where it's going. Here's normally where I would actually talk about the plot, but when I said the film had no idea what it was doing, I meant it. It feels like one of those "and then" movies, where everything was written on the fly, and whatever ideas they had, good or bad, usually bad, made it in. but I suppose I should at least try to summarize what happens, if only to make things easier for my therapist. So, over the top is a kid from LA who hasn't seen his mother in almost a year, since she's off looking for a rare spider in Chile that can, I think they say, cure insomnia, but it doesn't really matter, it's just a bit guffin. Anyway, Over the Top steals the credit cards from his dickish future stepfather and goes on a trip to see her, but the pilot is poisoned and the plane they're in crashes, though not before he tells Over the Top about a map leading to a treasure worth $15 million. And that all happens in the first 15 minutes. Given how much I've done so already, I really don't want to bring up pacing again, but I cannot emphasize enough the importance of finding the right balance when it comes to this sort of thing, and this film does not find that balance. It's way too fast, so character interactions are breezed through, and we barely get a chance to get to grips with any new people we meet before they're either shuffled off to one side or killed off. We barely even get to know Over the Top. Apparently he's pretty crafty and has a laptop that's super useful, but neither of those things are properly set up, and every time he utilizes one of them, you go, oh yeah, he can do that, which is not the sign of a well-written project. Another effect of the rushed pacing is that events seem to happen at random. They're clearly supposed to be fun and quirky, since again, this is a kids film, but in reality they just come across as bewildering and nonsensical. Again, it feels like an and then sort of affair, and it's hard to care about a story where you rarely know what's happening and no one seems to have any idea where things are going, least of all the cast. Speaking of, did I mention the acting sucks? Because oh boy does the acting suck. Like, you can kind of excuse it from the kids, they don't know any better, but I knew I was in trouble not even 10 minutes in when the mother, played by a grown woman I remind you, starts singing a tuneless ditty that just... Yeah, that turned me off her pretty quick. And no one else is much better. They're all comically over the top in a very amateurish manner, and it's actually quite difficult to get through. Or at least it was for me. Making things so much worse is the editing. This is the kind of film where in certain sequences, shots you'd expect to be there just aren't, presumably to keep up the fast pace of the film. So while there's technically enough information for you to piece together what's going on, it takes your brain a few seconds to actually do so. But the film's still doing stuff that you also have to focus on, creating this weird sort of mishmash. So, for example, you're figuring out that Over the Top got into the computer room through the window, since, you know, there was a quick shot of him wedging the window open with something earlier, but you're also trying to process what he's actually doing on the computer at the same time you're putting that together. And it all makes your brain hurt, because why wasn't there just a quick shot of him climbing in through the window? The film frequently has moments like this, and they make your brain hurt every single time. Let's just rattle off the other major flaws in a lightning round. The direction is pretty basic overall, the music can be overly intrusive at times, the comedy isn't funny, been a while since I last said that, the villains bounce between being comedic and deadly, resulting in very weird tonal shifts, and there's plot holes the size of canyons. Things like, how did the poisoned pilot ever have time to set up this surprisingly elaborate treasure hunt? Maybe if he'd had more than 4 minutes of screen time, we could have found out. Overall, like I said at the start, I did not think this was a good film, to the point I'm struggling for positive things to say. I suppose the soundtrack's okay when it's not too in your face, and I guess the cameras were at least pointed in the right direction, so yeah, that's all I got. I hated this, I really did. If I'd had to pay money for it, I'd have been seriously upset. As is, I'm just tired. So very tired. Oh, before I forget, the writer of Ice Cave would go on to pen the story for the third Darkman movie, which is completely irrelevant, except for the fact that I will never ever pass up the opportunity to tell people that film is called Die Darkman Die, which is, you know, just the best name ever. Let's see if we can leave the 80s behind with a bang, rather than an overwhelming desire for alcohol, with The Serpent of Death, or as it's known in most regions, Out of Time. Not entirely sure why, the first title is far more relevant than the latter. Anyway, this one's got Jeff Fahey as an archaeologist come treasure hunter, who you know is a good guy because he's friends with a girl in a wheelchair, who gets entangled in the search for the lost treasures of Alexander the Great. Oh, and did I mention he also gives lectures? You couldn't have asked for a more blatant indie wannabe. I don't say that lightly either, there are whole scenes that directly reference moments in the Indiana Jones films, including the one where Julian Glover gets Indy to read that tablet he's got. This is an IndyLike through and through, even if it's done on a fraction of the budget and doesn't look anywhere near as good, and I actually kind of enjoyed it as a result, though I will admit it does move way too fast. I'm not just talking about the pacing of the story there, though that is an issue as well. Mostly I mean the editing. Scenes can often end rather abruptly. while some will feel like there's a shot or two missing, and some will only last 30 seconds or so, meaning you really have to pay attention to keep up with what's going on, since characters and villains will often be introduced with very little setup, so it can be tricky to keep up with what's happening some of the time. Fortunately, Fahey is pretty decent company, even if he can be a bit of an arse at times early on. The woman he randomly hooks up with at the start turns out to be pretty fun company, and very well connected, which is a tad contrived, so a twist near the end of the film explains it away. And while it may move pretty fast, the adventure is, for the most part, kind of entertaining. I'm not saying it's a masterpiece or anything, because it absolutely isn't. The editing, which is the film's major flaw, is a very hard thing to overcome, though compared to something like Secret of the Ice Cave, it's a world apart. But there are other flaws as well, such as how the plot twists the film presents are a tad hard to swallow, and the ending is really kind of awkward. Technically all the pieces for it are set up ahead of time, but it still has the feel of something that kind of comes out of nowhere. Still, even if it isn't exactly fantastic, like I say, I still enjoyed this a fair bit, and who knows, maybe you will too. If you can find a version of this film with a decent picture quality, it might actually be worth tracking down. Just maybe don't go with the version on YouTube. It's watchable, but it's also so low res it can be hard to make out which character was which at times. Considering how confusing the plot is to follow at times, yeah. And with that, we've finally made it through to the end of the 80s, which I think is a pretty good place to stop for now. Don't worry, there are plenty more films yet to cover. Just looking at the list of stuff from the 90s alone is making me feel very, very afraid. But frankly, I need to take a break for a while and let my poor, damaged psyche recover somewhat. Also, let's be honest, this project's already way too long, to say nothing of how long it'll take me to edit together. And frankly, the whole point was to get it out while Dial of Destiny was still relevant, something I've managed to fail spectacularly at. Then again, I didn't realise just covering the 80s IndyLikes would take me nearly 4 hours, so swings and roundabouts, I guess. As we reach what I dearly hope is roughly the halfway point, what can we learn from all this? I don't know, this isn't exactly that kind of video, and even if it was, I'm nowhere near done. I barely managed to make my way through the insanity that was the 80s for pity's sake. But if I had to give you something to end this series on, I'd say it's that you can have all the fancy special effects and set pieces you want, but if you don't have likable characters, it's not really going to count for much. Films that shouldn't have worked often can anyway if the leads are charismatic enough, while conversely, seemingly surefire hits could often miss because the characters aren't particularly engaging, or worse, are unlikable, intentionally or not. A good cast of characters is essential to making an entertaining Indiana Jones-style adventure. I mean, it's not the only thing you need. A decent script, good pacing, and a competent director will help immensely, but I'd argue that good characters are the glue that holds everything together, and if you haven't got that, well, your project's probably going to fall apart. Thanks for joining me on this adventure to the unknown, and I'll see you at some point as we ride into the sunset that is the 90s.